Awesome. So, in celebration of Black History Month, members of the Black Googler Network in Ann Arbor created a film that explores their past experiences as it pertains to their initial realizations of being Black. This project was inspired by the 2017 CNN featurette, The First Time I Realized I Was Black, and the 1903 book by W.E.B. Du Bois entitled The Souls of Black Folk. We just finished watching an incredibly powerful film that showcases some poignant experiences that Black people in America face on a daily basis. And I'm honored to have the opportunity to unpack these stories here today with Stephanie. So, let's get started, right? There are a few stories that point out a specific moment where a physical feature or a sense of identity beyond just the color of someone's skin was the primary catalyst for the interviewee's personal experience. So we're talking about hair, the clothes, the origin of their name even, right? With your focus being on diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly in hierarchies of education, how would you say these catalysts can be potential obstacles or pitfalls in the Black experience in terms of education or professional environments?
Sure. So I want to say something first about context. I think it's really important to be clear about the context. The interviewees weren't just talking about their experiences of being Black within their home communities where everyone else identified the same way, right? We're talking about the first time mainly that folks realized they were Black, coming into contact with those who were different than them, right? What it's like to be Black in America, what it's like to be Black in the context of racism and white supremacy. So I want to be clear about that. And so when we're talking about racism or any form of oppression, there's a dominant culture, right? There's the dominant culture, and there's the culture around which we determine what's normal, right, and good, and everything outside of that can be seen as having less value or no value at all, right? So these catalysts that you mentioned, whether they're hair or clothes, they become pitfalls when they're put in the context of the dominant culture and they're seen as something, and the dominant culture isn't okay with that, right? So those pitfalls aren't just pitfalls in and of themselves. I want to make sure that we're talking about that, in context. So we see this coming up anytime we see Black folks coming into context with institutions where whiteness has been the norm, and those catalysts signal otherness in a way that the dominant culture isn't okay with. So we see that when we're interviewing for jobs and a particular name means we don't get a call back, or we see that when our dress is disciplined through dress codes, or we see that when we're disproportionately punished or pushed out of schools, right? And so those things add up, right? In the sort of minute, even though they're not minute instances, but they add up over time, and they keep us from gaining access to places, and they keep us from advancing in the places that we do gain access to. Yeah.
Absolutely. Awesome. So additionally, we see that many of these experiences can stem from just a pure misconception of a Black person as an individual, or even beyond that, Black people in general. So when we look back on the film, there was this idea of good Black, bad Black, ghetto, not ghetto, et cetera. But tying into that previous question, what could be the effects or outcomes of the experiences on Black people, and in what ways, if any at all, can we combat or clarify these misperceptions?
Yeah, so in my field, so in intergroup relations, we talk a lot about how people understand themselves as parts of various social groups, and either belonging or not belonging to groups, right? So we know that people tend to view folks within their own group as more favorable than the out group, and we also know that it's incredibly difficult to change folks' perception of those in the out group, even when positive images of those in the out group are presented to them, right? So that's why we see what we see. We, as was noted in the film, we see people continuing to have experiences with either white folks or non-Black folks of color where they're confronted with those stereotypes coming back to them in a negative way, right? No matter what they're presenting. But we need to remember that those cognitive processes, these processes of figuring out who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group, again, they happen in context, right? We're not just finding out where we belong and where we don't. We're finding out where we belong and where we don't in the context of racism. And so that means that our institutions are constantly giving us messages about who matters and who doesn't, who's in and who's out. What I think is really hopeful about that, and to answer your question about what we can do to combat it, it means that these things aren't innate, right? These senses of who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't, they're not necessarily innate. They are part of the messages that are constantly reinforced by our various institutions, be they schools, be they corporations, be they the criminal legal system. And so if they're not innate, if they're learned, that means that they can be unlearned. And so when you're talking about what we can do, I think that we begin to learn when we start to create different institutions, different social, political, economic structures that have different messages about who matters and who doesn't. And so then we start to internalize those messages as opposed to the ones that have been internalized. Everyone, I think, can take part in that in different ways, but I do think that's possible.
Awesome. So, taking a look at each of these stories, we also notice this realization of Blackness or being different and how it comes in many different forms. We saw the very overt, loud ways, and even some of the more subtle, covert ones when it comes to racial epithets being watched or followed, even questioned. With that in mind, what ways can you say this can alter the mannerisms or presentation of Black people that they give off in order just to validate their right to be somewhere or even maintain their own personal safety?
Yeah. So I want to say that there's a range of ways that people react to oppression. And what we saw in the film was representative of that range, right? Sometimes we respond by trying to educate someone else, trying to let them know why I'm different or we're different than a particular stereotype. Sometimes we shut down. Sometimes we are in shock and we're not really sure how to respond. And sometimes our response is fear, and that's very legitimate given what we know about how racist violence shows up in spaces. But I think that the interviewees pointed to a dilemma that lots of us can relate to, many Black folks can relate to, having to think about choices of our presentation, our style, the way we dress, the way we speak, who we interact with, or what we should do to make others comfortable, or at the very least, incite less fear if we feel like that's what we need to do. We can definitely be made to feel that way in the context that we're in. And I think those messages come and they've been internalized by us, they've been internalized by folks in our communities, and they have real impacts. I still live with folks, live amongst folks who think that pulling up your pants and straightening your hair is the thing to do. And to be fair, they've probably lived through experiences where that might have been true for them. But what I want to say about that is we know there's a cost to that, to those of us who have to do it, right? For those of us who are faced with that dilemma constantly of having to change whether to change our hair, change our style of dress, change the way that we speak, change who we associate with, that comes at a psychological cost to us, that comes at an emotional cost to us, that comes at an intellectual cost to us. And we know that it doesn't necessarily work, that it doesn't actually chip away at the systems that we're living in. It doesn't do anyone any favors in terms of restructuring the systems that we're in. So yes, I want to say, those impacts are definitely real. And we know that the ways that we're pressured to sort of shift, succumbing to that pressure doesn't help us, and it doesn't sort of shift the places that we're living in.
Absolutely. Now, I guess with all of that being said, for those who are on the outside looking in on these experiences that Black or minority communities endure on a daily basis, what would you say the role of an ally could be in efforts to dispel those misconceptions and combat moments like the ones mentioned in the film in a supportive or a productive way?
So I think allies, and in this case, allies to people of color, I'm talking about white folks, and in certain situations, other non-Black folks of color. I think the most supportive and productive work they can do is realize the work that they have to do within themselves and in their communities, and let that be their focus. So white and non-Black folks of color should ask themselves how they're implicated in a racist society. How have they benefited? How have they participated in these systems, actively or passively? It is impossible to be in the society that we're in without sort of breathing in the fog of these systems, right? So I think the thing that folks can do is really focus on their participation and focus on how they've benefited and focus on that type of work. When you're asking yourselves those questions, that leads you to the places you should go, which is to other folks who want to band up with you and push back against these systems, right? And then you can do it from a more empathetic place. So if you're doing your own work, if you're focused on sort of the internal work that you have to do and the work that you have to do within your own communities, not necessarily about being the best ally or being the most down person, it puts you in a place to be empathetic. So when your friend's mom says, I don't want my child playing with black folks, you can say, hey, you know, Susie or whoever, I too, I know, we've been in the same community, we've grown up in the same place, I know we've gotten those same messages. Why don't we think about how we can unpack that as opposed to maybe some of the other ways that we see folks intervening, which is much more about sort of maybe making sure that they appear to be the best ally or seen that way by others.
Absolutely. And I guess just as far as my final question, and I think it would be remiss of me not to ask, of course, with this being the case, but Stephanie, what is the first time you realized you were black?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and as was mentioned in the film, I grew up in a black space, black community, black schools, black extracurricular activities, and so I think I had a pretty deep sense of being proud of my blackness when I was younger. When I went to middle school, it was the first time I'd gone to a racially integrated middle school, and the thing to do was read 17 magazine. I don't know if that's but this is like the late 90s. So I went from being obsessed with Aaliyah and trying to wear my hair like over one eye to the thing was beach waves. Like the girls on the covers of the magazine are supposed to have beach waves, and so I remember I had this edition of 17 magazine, and it was like all about how to get beach waves. And so I bought all this stuff, and they were like, spray your roots and like blow dry it. And so I tried to do this, and my mom just watched me like wear myself out with this. And she goes, and I was like, Mom, I can't do it. I want beach waves. And she just goes, you're black, get over it. And it was one of those, but she said it in this way that wasn't necessarily punishing. It was like, this is who you are, and that's not a thing. Like I'm gonna let you have your moment. But this is different, than what you have and what you have to offer. So that was one of the first moments. But I will say, in the context of what I do every day, I'm a faculty member on a university campus, and I think I'm reminded often of my blackness in the same way that lots of folks mentioned in the film. I constantly am in spaces where I may be maybe not the only person of color, but the only black person, or I'm the only black woman, or I'm definitely the youngest person by a long shot. So I'm reminded in that way as well. That those are some moments. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. I guess. When you point that out, I see there's obviously the very two different distinctions of that realization, but going to the former of those, getting that initial identification from someone in your familial group, right? How has that experience vary from, like you said, the everyday experiences that you have now?
Yeah, so I think in that instance with my mom, I'm her child, and I was her daughter, her black daughter, who's an image of her and someone that she had raised to be very, very proud of that. And so her reminder of my blackness was one that was out of love, right? Like these are all the things that you should embrace, right? Even though you're not maybe reflected in some of the dominant images that we see, what you have is still beautiful and valuable. I think compared to the latter instances, maybe, my blackness sometimes or oftentimes, depending on what is happening, is a reminder of those larger systems in which folks haven't been able to advance in the ways that they should, right? I don't look around campus and notice that there are a few black faculty and think, we just can't do this. It's because there are certain systems that are set up to prevent that, or actively or passively, right? And so I think the first is different from the last in that way. Is that helpful?
Yes, very much so. And I also would just want to ask, being that you're here at Google with us today, but you're speaking to your personal experiences at the University of Michigan. In what ways, or if there are any, are these misconceptions or are these structures being combated on the university from not only a student perspective, but also from that of a faculty member?
Yeah. So Michigan has been a couple years into its diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, and those are things that we see across the nation, right, in various places. And I think a lot about that in my research. I think particularly about how social justice education programs, which I'm a part of one, how they sort of fare in this space of diversity, equity, inclusion, these spaces that were built to teach students how to think about, or actually to push them to think critically about these systems that we live in, and do it through peer-to-peer learning. I think a lot about how educational spaces like that were built in the university, but built to push back against some of the institutional racism that we see, how they actually do under diversity and equity inclusion plans. And interestingly, what we see is that sometimes the edge sort of gets blunted off when we bring in some diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We sometimes start to see an incorporation of the things that were maybe most radical or most challenging sort of get swept up into that in a way that some folks wouldn't be comfortable with. But I will say, amongst faculty at all times and amongst staff at all times, there's always a contestation to that type of institutional racism that we see, whether it is by being a part of the institution and trying to create a way for others to come into it and thereby make it different, or it's trying to be supportive of what students are doing, try to be supportive of policies and procedures that are going to shift what our campus looks like, and not only what our campus looks like, but the ways that we're participating in our campus. Or whether it's folks who are questioning what's going on, right? Whether they're questioning policing on our campus, or questioning who comes to campus, or questioning what is taught in our classrooms, right? That's an incredibly powerful tool that faculty always have at their disposal, right? What is taught in their classrooms. So people are always pushing back in those ways. And I think it's important to think about the ways that we see that in an institutionalized way, and the ways that we just see it popping up from various folks here and there and everywhere. So, yeah.
And then also, being that many of us here in the Ann Arbor office at Google are members of that very community, whether we be sprinkled within or on the outskirts of the university's campus. With that in mind, what ways, if any, would we be able to find a way to assist or lend our services in any way in order to build a greater cohesion amongst our two communities?
Yeah, I would say keep conversations like this going is the first one. But also, I would be interested to know what Google is doing in terms of DEI, but also on the sides of that, what are the interactions like between people? Are you making time to think about difference and how it shows up in your community, in your workspace? And again, focusing on what you're doing and then finding the natural sort of ways to bond with others, right? So if Google is partnered up with Michigan in some ways, I don't know, right, what those ways might be, but if Google is partnered up in those ways, thinking about how to make that partnership, one that benefits the most marginalized folks within Michigan's community, and thinking about how to further that at every turn, right? And making that the focus of your program. So one, what are you already doing? And then how do you shift that so it's the most just way that you can connect with the Michigan community, those who are coming in. So doing a lot of the internal work and then transferring that outward. That makes sense.
It does. Okay. It does. That is it for my portion of the questions, but I do want to open the floor up to anyone in the audience who may just have some questions pertaining to the film in general, or any questions specifically for Stephanie that we can try to address.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks, for coming. I really appreciated the talk. The question that I have is, often Black individuals who are considered successful and often navigate white spaces are often called terms like Oreo, or accused of talking white by both individuals in the dominant group, but also by people in the in their own group as well. And so, you know, sometimes these terms can be used by white individuals as terms of acceptance, like, oh no, you're one of us, you're an Oreo. But often, if you really, like, you know, dissect what the term Oreo means, it really is associating blackness with mediocrity and whiteness with success. And so how do we reshape this narrative where that is often the case?
Yeah. So again, this makes me think about intergroup relations, and right now I'm actually teaching foundations of intergroup relations, and our students are thinking about this very thing, right? It's the moment where we've just passed the moment where we're thinking about stereotypes and how they're activated and how they're formed. And the students are, you know, they're hitting a wall, as we all do, because they're like, wait, so you mean I've been learning this from a very young age? What is, you know, what is going on? What does this mean? And so we start to talk about socialization, right? The way that we move through those various institutions that I talked about, right? The legal system, our educational system, our religious institutions, media, what have you. And we realize that we're getting much of our messages that we're getting from there, and we're getting them from people that we know and respect, right? So it's not just someone's yelling at you horrible things about an out group, and you're just taking them. These things are coming from spaces that we know and trust, which is what helps them continue. So I think what we really need to think about, again, is socialization, right? Who are we coming into contact with at our earliest, most formative stages and throughout our progression? And how do we not necessarily shift who those people are, right? We still want to be a part of our communities, but shift how we're sharing those messages and shift how we're combating those messages at every turn. So what that means, though, is that we have to change structures so that those interactions are different, right? It's really hard to have these interactions with others that help us see or get a window into a different perspective if it's still couched in the same larger system, right? Then that just, you know, you're seeking out information that confirms what you already know, right? So you just get this new example, and it's a one-off. So we have to change. We have to change schools. We have to change what's going on in homes. We have to change how we're consuming media. But that means that we have to first notice what we're coming into contact with, and we have to notice that it's a problem, right? If we're not necessarily thinking about the messages that we receive through media or the messages that we receive through school as being problematic, we don't really have an impetus to change them, right? So we have to do a lot of consciousness raising, but I think, again, that comes from people, that can come from these moments of dissonance that we have, but that can also just come from starting to do the work, right? Those of us who know that we need something different start the process of creating those structures, however we see fit, and that can be 1 by 1 and 2 by 2. But you know, even in a space like Google, right? How are you impacting what messages people get about what it means to be Black and the value of being Black and what that means in the context of whiteness? How are you all shaping those messages, and how can you be a part of how people are being socialized around those things? So.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. Megan Uhas, one of the leaders in the office. Some of us in this room are parents, and maybe you answered a little bit of this question in your last response, but would love to hear what are the 1 to 2 things that we can do, to really raise our children to be more accepting of others.
Yeah. So I'll say first, I'm speaking as a non-parent, and so I just want to name that because I want to be clear that I don't know exactly what it's like to be a parent. But what I do think, and this is something that goes for everyone, but I think in the context of parenting, it makes a lot of sense. Talk to other parents, right? So I think we often have this this perception or this understanding, and I think it comes from a well-intentioned place, that the second we learn all this new information, we have to find the biggest, boldest way to shout it from the rooftops and change everything overnight. Being a parent is an incredibly powerful role, right? So both because of the interaction that you have with your children, but because of the interaction that you have with other parents, right? So I think one of the most important things that you can do is start to talk to other parents about what it is you're seeing, right? What is it that you're coming to understand? What do you still not understand? What is still complex and confusing? And building power within yourselves, what might you do then to start to unlearn some of the things that you've learned, right? I think it's a really powerful question when people start to ask themselves, how did we get here, right? How did we find ourselves in the situation that we're in? Because that then helps you identify both what's missing and other folks who share that same concern. And then you can think about, as parents, what are your next best steps, right? What are the ways that what are your parenting styles like? What are you doing with your children? And how could that be in the service of shifting some of these messages that come around you? Yeah.
Hi, thank you again for coming. My question is, in the height of an era where it kind of, I'm sure you've heard this, but like racists aren't really scared anymore and they're kind of out and showing themselves to us, as an educator, do you come across a lot of frustration when it comes to being the person that's trying to teach people? And does it feel like we're kind of reverting back to all of the work that was done through the civil rights movement, through all the people that kind of paved the way for us? Do you feel like this radicalization is making you take huge steps back, or do you feel like it's opening the space for you to have conversations more freely?
So I think the answer is D, all the above. So in terms of what it makes me think of as an educator, well, I should say this. Before I was at the University of Michigan, I was at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which is a different context and a different city. I'm from Chicago. I'm from the south side of Chicago. Yeah, I was from Chicago. I was in that space, and my student body looked different, right? Because it was just a different space and a different type of institution. So a lot of what's happening or not what's happening in my classroom, but a lot of the classes that I teach or the courses that I teach, my student body just looks different. I look out into a classrooms that are filled with more white students, filled with more wealthy students, and that is the nature of those two different institutions. And so I think that, sure, I'm confronted with different things. But I do think that, there's a sense in which some folks are more emboldened. But I think we have to think about the ways in which white supremacy and all of these various institutions that we're talking about show themselves every day and have shown themselves every day sort of before the current moment. And they show themselves in sort of really nuanced ways that come up even out of the most sort of well-meaning ways, right? So in my classroom, actually, because I'm teaching a lot of classes that are around intergroup relations, and a lot of students opt into them, and they want to be a part of them, I actually don't have regular experiences with, in my classroom, with students who hold those types of views, though they do present themselves definitely around campus and in the greater context. But what I do see is the ways that we are all implicated in these systems every day, right? And sometimes actually that can be challenging and difficult to work with in a different way, because we are all working on the assumption that we're really good people, and we're really good people who don't hold particular ideas, and we want to stop the bad thing over there. Racism is the bad thing over there, and racists are the bad people over there that we want to stop. And when we're working from that place, we can sort of fail to see how we allow these messages that the dominant culture gives to impact all that we do, whether we're actively doing it or not. So yes, I do see some things that make me think, one, I'm tired and I don't want to get up in front of this classroom and teach this again. Some days I definitely have that struggle. But I also think that my job provides a lot of hope, because what I do see often too are a lot of folks who are part of that dominant culture who are trying to think differently. So it's a mixed bag. It really, really is. So I see both and. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're just coming up on time. So again, thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us today. This discussion was very helpful, very powerful. I hope that it is of some service to you and the audience today. But again, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.